Hello and welcome to The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. In this edition, in the week leading up to International Women's Day on March 8th, we're putting women and health in the spotlight. In a new report from the CIO of UBS Global Wealth Management, Marianna Mamou, head of Advice Beyond Investing, and a regular on this show, explores the impact of the gender health gap, what it is and how it affects women's lives and financial well-being. We will also discuss recent rapid growth in awareness around women's health and in the startup scene of some truly innovative companies trying to provide solutions to some of these thorny problems. It's a pleasure to welcome Marianna Mamou back to the show. Marianna, thanks for being with us. And look, this is a fascinating report. Before we dig in, though, to the findings and discuss some really compelling case studies as well of these femtech companies that are really moving the needle, just take a step back and remind us, why is this gender health gap? Well, why does it exist? And why is it so critical to act to close it now?
So starting with why it exists, we need to go back a bit in history. For much of the 20th century, women, especially those who could be pregnant, were often left out of clinical trials, mainly due to concerns about pregnancy risks and also the complications that arise from hormonal cycles in terms of understanding research data. Today, these rules call for sex-specific analysis and transparency in clinical trial enrollment, but still, even today, inclusion, while it has improved, gaps still remain. In addition to this underrepresentation in clinical trials, women's health is also underrepresented and underfunded in research. So based on a report by Nature in 2020, only 5% of global healthcare R&D funding is allocated to women's health, with just 1% directed towards non-cancer, women-specific conditions. And even from this, 25% is further limited to fertility research. So we see that there is a very narrow focus that disproportionately gets invested in certain topics and not in others. And maybe it's good to clarify that when we talk about women's health, we don't only talk about conditions that are unique to women, such as endometriosis, women's oncology, and fertility. But there are also many diseases that affect women disproportionately, like autoimmune diseases, osteoporosis, depression, and there are also those that affect women differently. And based on the recent McKinsey study, almost half of their health burden reflects conditions that affect them disproportionately. So without this data and research knowledge and these discrepancies, they result in big limitations in terms of what we know and what we understand around how best to treat women. And as a result, we face big barriers to care and experience diagnostic delays that impact their physical and mental well-being.
And it's interesting, isn't it? There are other manifestations of the similar problem, because if we look at things like waits for diagnostics, even for very serious conditions, as you say, that don't affect only women, if we look at cancer or diabetes, women wait far longer for diagnosis. That's what the research tells us. But even in incredibly short term, even at A&E, women tend to present the same severity of pain, but will be made to wait longer. So there are so many layers to these biases, aren't there?
Yes, because exactly to your point, beyond just the data and research discrepancies that we talked about, there are also biases that make it hard for women to become more visible. So, for example, as you mentioned, there are gender discrepancies in pain management. Medical professionals take longer to address women's pain, and when they do so with less, let's say, medication. So a recent study showed that women wait on average 30 minutes longer for pain relief. And this is attributed to what is referred to as a gender pain exaggeration bias, where women are viewed as more emotional and as a result seen as potentially exaggerating their pain. And based on a recent report, this pain dismissal affects women of all ages, and it even starts as young as 10 years old, which is extremely shocking, I would say, and alarming. And there are other biases that we can see. So, for example, it's interesting to note that procedures for men are reimbursed at rates that are approximately 30% higher than those for women. And by valuing women's operations lower, it creates less incentives from hospitals and research to invest in offering solutions. So then, as you described, we have such discrepancies and such delays in also diagnostics with quite shocking statistics. There is this Danish study that found women are diagnosed later than men for over 700 diseases. Women wait 2.5 years longer for a cancer diagnosis and 4.5 years longer for a diabetes diagnosis compared to men. And that is because we typically derive the diagnosis from the data that were derived from clinical trials that used also men.
Now, Marianna, we've discussed obviously the wealth gap in broader terms before, but the report, I think, very cleverly speaks to how the health gap also then sort of plays into that wealth gap. And there are various reasons for this, which it outlines, which perhaps we can touch upon briefly. You know, the health burden affects women of working age in particular, but there's a whole raft of reasons, aren't there, how this backdrop that you've described then shapes not just physical, but financial well-being going into the future.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, from our perspective, looking at women's wealth and trying to help them prepare and plan and invest accordingly so that they can meet their objectives, we highlight that this health gap affects not also their physical and mental well-being, but also their financial well-being. And as you mentioned, based on the McKinsey Health Institute report, nearly half of the health burden falls on women of working age. So it does affect the work-life balance, the mental health, the career progression, which leads to less earnings, savings, and investments. And a very critical consideration regarding the pension allocation and the savings for retirement is that women face a higher probability of retiring early. And based on a survey, when asking them and looking at what is the top reason for retiring early, by men, we see that it's because they are tired of working. But for women, the top reason is related to health. And a critical moment, or say transition in women's life, is the menopause, where many women, while at their peak of their careers and their earnings, they are forced to reduce employment or even take time off. Studies show that 1 in 10 women have left a job directly due to menopause symptoms, and 1 in 4 women feel that this transition has negatively impacted their career progression. And going back to work after taking some time off at that age typically proves also very challenging. So that affects their retirement savings. And on top of that, as we mentioned in the report, we see that there is higher medical expenses. So women spend nearly 30% more out of pocket on prescriptions in the United States. And they spend also more than double in expenditures on depression and anxiety than men. And during menopause, specifically, healthcare costs spike. And in the US, they spend over $13 billion annually on treating menopause symptoms. So on the one hand, health conditions make it challenging to accumulate and save and invest. Then you have higher expenses that make it harder, again, to save and invest. And then you need to make your investments last longer, as women typically live longer than men.
Well, yeah, and actually, you put it sort of pithily, and I mean, it's no less shocking, but it's put so elegantly. Women earn less, they pay more, and they're stretched further, it's as shocking as the stats you gave us earlier about those biases manifesting themselves from the age of just 10 years old. What do we do then about it, Marianna? And this is what I did enjoy about the report, is that you then get to look to some incredible innovations and this idea that maybe by investing in female health, we can start to try and turn around some of these very ingrained societal and structural factors and actually recognise that there are clear economic and social benefits in investing in women's health. Whilst it's never going to be a panacea, just tell us a little bit about why maybe looking at this category differently and thinking more strategically about investing in it can address some of these problems.
Yes, absolutely. This is a great economic opportunity. And as it was quantified by the McKinsey Health Institute and the World Economic Forum, addressing these issues would not only improve the length and quality of the women's lives, but it would boost the global economy, but more than $1 trillion annually by 2040. So in a way, the call to action is around increasing investments in women's health, in better understanding and improving access to care, which means expanding the inclusion in clinical trials, deepening insight, investing in innovations. And we describe in the report the tremendous growth in the femtech area, But also beyond the innovations in that space, we need to ensure that solutions are scalable and that all women can benefit. And that means that also regulatory legislations, insurance companies, everyone needs to be aligned so that the progress that is made from individual, let's say, femtech and investments actually gets integrated and all women can have access to the care and the diagnostics that they deserve.
Well, Marianna, it's interesting that the report is a little bit of a kind of game of two halves. And the first half describes this backdrop and explains why this action is necessary. And then we go into this next phase, which is some amazing case studies, interviews with some leaders in the space, some of whom have actually been on this program before. Lu Zhang from Fusion Fund, for example. Tell me a little bit about why it's so instructive to then illustrate this theory with these real world examples. I guess it's brilliant, not only because they show their investment success stories, but also because these are leaders of these businesses who then can describe how their successes have driven progress on exactly these thorny themes we've been talking about, right?
Yes, I thought it would be powerful to include the voices from people that are in the ecosystem, either as investors or clinicians or founders of companies that are trying to address this gap, because it needs the entire ecosystem to work together in order to sustainably make a difference. And I think what is really positive and optimistic is that I think now is the time that everything is coming together. So on the one hand, what we've seen over the last year is that there is increasing awareness around the lack of understanding the female health. And talking about some of these topics is no longer taboo as it used to. And millennial women, as they are also aging, they are a driving force demanding and expecting better solutions. And we should not forget that women are responsible for 80% of household healthcare decisions. But also of significance is that there is growing alignment amongst the key stakeholders. So regulatory bodies are actually updating guidelines. Payers are integrating value-based metrics, and healthcare providers are pursuing innovative care pathways. So I think this collective momentum reflects a fundamental transformation within healthcare that should enable us to become more innovative, and not just for the benefit of women's health, but in general, I think that will mean that everyone will benefit.
Well, yeah, and perhaps we just dip into one or two of the case studies. I was really struck by Tatum Getty's, the founding general partner of Athena Capital, in part because, and she explains her sort of interest in the sector, of course, as a woman, as a mother, and who had some complications during her pregnancies as well. But also, she says, as a marketer by background and as an investor now. And I think it's really interesting that those threads are drawn together, and it really speaks to how successful she is and Athena Capital is, but also the incredible perspicacity she brings to her analysis of this sector, right?
Oh, absolutely. All of the cases are tremendously impactful and interesting and worth reading. And in general, what I found fascinating as talking to different women, of course, knowing it also personally, myself and friends, that nearly every woman has a story of symptoms that may have been overlooked, pain that could have been dismissed, or diagnosis delayed. So it is really something that has been a lived experience. And of course, you can say that women who, as we said, hold the household healthcare decisions, obviously is a great market force to better understand them and provide solutions that they need. And as the great wealth transfer also takes place, we see that women will have more wealth in their hands, and this will allow them to spend more, but also invest themselves in solutions that they care for, such as health for women, as Tatum described.
Yeah, and Marianna, just on that, because something we've discussed before is the predominance of male investors, certainly in VC, in some other areas, and how, some of these innate biases can manifest themselves and actually can overlook serious opportunity. I think it might have even been in Tatum's discussion as well, that she talks about opportunities in women's health, and that even many existing innovations that are there to serve women and to aid their health and well-being are overlooked for those same reasons. Do you think we are maybe at an inflection point, or if not an inflection point, that we're moving positively? And could that pivot in the balance of control of global wealth? As you said, it will be majority controlled by women by, I think, 2050. Is that going to maybe be the final thing that pushes us over the line and starts to drive progress, more at the pace that we actually need to see it?
Yes, I do believe that we are at an inflection point. I mean, we've seen that the total VC dollars going to women's health more than tripled between 2019 and 2024, outpacing generally healthcare as a whole. Still, having said that, in 2024, the women's health companies accounted for only 2.3% of total VC investments. But it's also what we mentioned before, that the demographic shifts and the fact that millennial women are aging and have different expectations regarding solutions, and the great wealth transfer of women holding wealth and being able to invest in solutions that they care about, as well as, I think, the increasing awareness that women's health is not a niche because we are 51% of the population, but also because when we talk about women's health, we don't only talk about conditions that are unique to women. Then I think all of these together, the increased awareness, the increased expectation and demand for better solutions, as well as women holding more wealth in their hands and therefore able to invest in these solutions, will make a big difference and a big change that we are seeing now also in the different stakeholders and the ecosystem. Of course, we shouldn't just rely on it and say, okay, by itself, it will sort out. It is important to invest and do so in a scalable way. Otherwise, it will be more talk than actually a solution.
Absolutely. Well, look, Marianna, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. But, as I guess in the week when we're building up to International Women's Day, to train a lens on this area and hear about the report is particularly fascinating and welcome. So thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
The brilliant Marianna Mamou bringing us to the end of this edition of the show here on Monocle Radio. You can listen again and explore more at monocle.com. That's where you can join the club and subscribe to Monocle magazine. And as always, you can discover more and find out how UBS can help you at ubs.com. This is The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.